I used to think that the most dangerous part of this job was the reckless drivers on the highway or the possibility of getting a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. But after what happened at the Brentmore high-rise building, I realized that the true terrors are the ones that wait for you behind a closed door in a hallway that feels miles away from the rest of the world. It was nearly midnight on a humid Thursday when the notification popped up on my phone for a high-paying delivery to a luxury apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district. The order was massive, consisting of 3 heavy bags of expensive Italian food, and the tip promised in the app was enough to make me ignore the bad feeling growing in my stomach. As I pulled into the shadow of the massive concrete structure, I noticed that more than half of the windows were completely dark, giving the building the appearance of a giant, rotting tooth sticking out of the city skyline. The lobby was empty and smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarettes, which was strange for a building that claimed to be high-end on its exterior signage. I approached the elevator bank and pressed the button for the 10th floor, but the only response I got was a dull, mechanical clunk followed by a flickering light that eventually died out. I sighed, knowing I couldn't just leave the food in the lobby if I wanted to keep my high rating, so I pushed open the heavy steel door to the stairwell. The sound of the door closing behind me was incredibly loud, echoing up the concrete shaft like a gunshot in a library. I began the long climb, my breathing getting heavier with every flight of stairs, while the dim yellow bulbs on each landing cast long, distorted shadows against the peeling paint of the walls. By the time I reached the 10th floor, I was drenched in sweat and my legs were burning from the effort of carrying the heavy bags. I pushed through the door into the hallway and was immediately struck by how silent it was, as if the thick carpet was absorbing every sound I made. I looked down the long corridor for apartment 404, but the numbers on the doors were inconsistent and messy, jumping from 401 to 415 without any logical order. I pulled out my phone to message the customer, but the screen showed absolutely no signal, which was impossible since I was in the middle of a major city. I walked further into the maze of the hallway, noticing that the air was getting colder and the flickering lights overhead were humming with a high-pitched sound that made my teeth ache. Finally, I found a door at the very end of a narrow side passage that had a small, handwritten note taped over the peephole that simply said, "Leave it inside." This was the first major red flag, because the app specifically stated that this was a hand-it-to-me order that required a signature for the high-value items. I hesitated, standing there in the silence, wondering if I should just drop the bags and run back to the safety of my car. But just as I turned to leave, the door creaked open just an inch, revealing a pitch-black interior and the faint smell of something metallic and sharp. A voice came from the darkness, sounding thin and strained, asking me to please bring the food to the kitchen table because they were unable to walk. I should have listened to my instincts, which were screaming at me to get out of there, but the thought of a person in genuine need made me step across the threshold into the dark apartment. As soon as my feet hit the hardwood floor, I heard a clicking sound behind me, and the heavy door swung shut with a finality that made my heart drop into my throat. I reached for the light switch on the wall, but nothing happened when I toggled it, leaving me standing in a room that felt much larger and emptier than it should have been. The voice called out again, but this time it came from behind me, and it didn't sound weak or elderly anymore. It sounded cold and focused, telling me that I shouldn't have come inside, and that the exit was now blocked from the outside. I dropped the bags of food, the sound of the plastic containers hitting the floor being the only thing I could hear over the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I lunged for the door handle, twisting it with all my strength, but it felt like it had been welded shut or bolted from the hallway. I turned around, my eyes finally adjusting to the dark, and I saw a figure standing at the end of the long hallway leading to the bedrooms. They weren't moving, just standing there with something long and heavy in their hand, watching me struggle against the locked door. My mind raced through my options, realizing that I was trapped on the 10th floor of a building where nobody could hear me and my phone was a useless piece of plastic. I began to back away toward the kitchen, hoping to find a window or another exit, while the figure began to walk toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall sounded like a hammer hitting a nail, and I realized that they weren't in a hurry because they knew I had nowhere to go. I reached the kitchen counter and my hand landed on a heavy glass vase, which I gripped tightly as a pathetic excuse for a weapon. I saw a small service door near the pantry, the kind used for trash chutes or maintenance, and I realized it was my only chance to escape the closing distance between me and the intruder. I scrambled toward it, ignoring the voice that was now telling me to stay still and that it would all be over quickly if I just cooperated. I threw myself against the small service door, and to my absolute shock, it gave way, revealing a narrow metal chute that led straight down into the darkness. It was a terrifying choice, but the figure was now only a few feet away, their face hidden by a mask that looked like it was made of old bandages. I didn't think. I just dived into the chute, praying that there was something soft at the bottom or that it wasn't a straight drop to the basement. The slide was fast and violent, the metal side scraping against my arms and back as I plummeted through the darkness of the building's internal structure. I felt like I was falling for an eternity before I slammed into a massive pile of discarded cardboard boxes and trash bags at the bottom. The impact knocked the wind out of me, leaving me gasping for air in the foul-smelling darkness of the basement trash room. I didn't wait to see if the person was coming down after me. I scrambled out of the bin and sprinted toward the glowing red exit sign across the room. I burst through the final door and out into the cool night air, not stopping until I reached my car and locked the doors with shaking hands. I drove away so fast that my tires screamed against the pavement, and I didn't stop until I saw a police cruiser parked near a well-lit gas station 3 miles away. When the police eventually went back to the Brentmore building to investigate, they found apartment 404 was completely empty of furniture and the door was standing wide open. There was no one there, and the Italian food I had dropped was gone. But they found something much worse. Taped to the inside of the door was a photo of my car from the parking lot, taken just minutes before I had entered the building. They had been waiting for me, and if I hadn't jumped into that chute, I would have become just another missing person in a city that doesn't care about the people who deliver its dinner. The city at 3 in the morning is a completely different world than the one people see during the day, as the bright neon lights of the downtown district create long, distorted shadows that seem to move when you look at them out of the corner of your eye. I had been driving for nearly 7 hours straight, and the exhaustion was starting to settle into my bones like a heavy weight, but the surge pricing was too good to pass up on a rainy Friday night. I accepted a final delivery from a 24-hour diner that was located in a narrow alleyway behind the main theater district, a place where the brick walls are covered in layers of old posters and the ground is always damp with something you don't want to think about too much. The order was just a single cup of black coffee and a side of fries, which seemed like a strange thing to pay a premium delivery fee for, but I didn't question it because I just wanted to finish my shift and go home to my bed. I pulled my car into the mouth of the alley, leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting through the thick mist that was rolling off the nearby river. Because the diner was tucked so far back, I had to leave my vehicle and walk about 50 feet to the pickup window, which felt like a mile in the eerie silence of the empty street. I grabbed the bag and the coffee, noting how the steam rose into the cold air, and I turned back to my car, which was idling patiently in the dark. As I walked back, I noticed that my interior dome light was flickering, which was odd because I was certain I had turned it off before getting out. I dismissed it as an electrical glitch caused by the damp weather, and I climbed back into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut and locking it immediately as a matter of habit. I put the car in gear and began to drive toward the customer's address, which was a residential area about 10 minutes away. I was listening to a low-volume podcast to keep my mind sharp, but something felt different about the atmosphere inside the car. The air felt heavier, and there was a faint, metallic smell that hadn't been there before, like the scent of wet coins or old rust. I glanced at the dashboard, checking my fuel levels, and then my eyes drifted upward to the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape in the back seat, a dark mass that didn't belong there, but when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but the empty headrests and the glow of the streetlights passing by. I told myself I was just hallucinating from the lack of sleep, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that the hair on the back of my neck began to stand up. I reached over to turn up the heater, but as I did, I heard a very soft, wet sound coming from directly behind my head, like someone taking a very slow, shallow breath. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white against the leather. I didn't want to look back because I knew that if I saw someone sitting there, I would lose control of the car and crash into the concrete pillars of the overpass I was currently driving under. I decided to test my theory without turning around, so I adjusted the side mirror slightly so I could see a wider angle of the rear passenger side. My blood turned to ice when I saw a pair of pale, thin fingers slowly gripping the edge of the seat directly behind me. Someone had managed to slip into my back seat during the 30 seconds I was at the diner window, and they had been sitting there in total silence, waiting for me to get onto the highway where I couldn't easily stop or jump out. The realization that I was trapped in a moving metal box with a stranger who meant me harm sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I knew I couldn't pull over because as soon as the car stopped, they would move, and I didn't know if they had a weapon. I looked at the GPS and saw that there was a police station just 2 miles away, but it required me to take a series of turns through a deserted industrial park. I began to speed up, hoping the momentum would keep the intruder pressed back into the seat, and I saw the fingers on the headrest tighten as the car accelerated. I could see the silhouette of a head rising up in the mirror, a dark figure wearing a hood that obscured their face entirely. They didn't say a word, which was the most terrifying part, as they just sat there watching me drive, playing a silent game of cat and mouse at 60 miles per hour. As I approached the turn for the police station, I realized that the intruder was starting to lean forward, reaching toward my neck with those same pale, skeletal hands. I didn't have time to wait for the station, so I saw a large, plastic water barrel barrier near a construction zone up ahead, and I made a split-second decision. I slammed on the brakes with everything I had, causing the tires to scream and the car to fishtail violently across the wet pavement. The sudden force of the deceleration sent the intruder flying forward, their body slamming into the back of my seat and then tumbling into the footwell of the passenger side. I didn't wait for them to recover, as I threw the car into park and fumbled for the door handle, screaming at the top of my lungs to draw any attention I could. I tumbled out of the car and onto the cold asphalt, sprinting toward the bright lights of a nearby 24-hour gas station while looking back over my shoulder. I saw the back door of my car swing open and the hooded figure scrambled out, but instead of chasing me, they vanished into the darkness of the industrial park like a ghost disappearing into the fog. I made it to the gas station and the clerk called the police, who arrived within minutes to inspect my vehicle. They found a long, serrated blade tucked into the pocket of the seat where the person had been hiding, and there was a small piece of paper left on the floorboard with my license plate number written on it. The police told me that this wasn't a random act, and that someone had likely been following me for several deliveries, waiting for the perfect moment when I left my car unlocked in a dark alley. I stopped doing late-night deliveries after that, because every time I sit in a car now, I can't help but check the floorboards and the trunk. I still have nightmares about those pale fingers gripping the seat and the silent breath of a person who was just inches away from ending my life for no reason at all. There is a specific kind of silence that you only find in gated communities deep in the suburbs, a silence that feels heavy and artificial, as if the expensive trees and manicured lawns are trying to hide something beneath the surface. It was just past 2 in the morning on a Sunday, the kind of hour where the world feels like it has been abandoned by everyone except for those of us working the gig economy. I received an order for a single expensive steak and a bottle of high-end sparkling cider, and the delivery address was located at the very end of a winding road in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county. To get there, I had to pass through a heavy iron gate that opened automatically when I scanned the order code, and the sound of it locking behind me was the first time I felt a chill of true unease. I drove for nearly 3 miles past massive estates that were completely dark, their long driveways disappearing into the shadows of thick oak trees that lined the private road. Finally, I reached the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modern structure made of glass and cold gray stone that looked more like a fortress than a home. The customer had selected the hand it to me option, but as I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed that not a single light was on inside the house, not even a porch light to guide my way. I stepped out of the car, the sound of my footsteps on the gravel feeling incredibly loud in the oppressive quiet of the forest surrounding the property. I walked up to the massive front door, which was a slab of dark wood with no windows, and I pressed the doorbell, hearing it chime deep inside the house with a melody that sounded slow and mournful. I waited for a full minute, checking my phone to make sure I was at the right location. But there was no movement from within the house and no sound of footsteps approaching the door. I was about to leave the food on the doorstep and take a photo to complete the order, but then my phone buzzed with a new message from the customer that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The message said, "The side gate is open. Please bring the order to the patio out back, as I am currently in the pool and cannot come to the front door." This was a direct violation of my personal safety rules, as I never enter a stranger's backyard at night. But the app showed a massive $500 tip pending that was clearly meant to bribe me into compliance. I looked at the side of the house and saw a small iron gate that was indeed standing slightly ajar, leading into a dark garden that was overgrown with thick vines and decorative statues. I told myself that it was just a wealthy person being eccentric, so I gripped the bag of food and slowly pushed the gate open, the hinges screaming with a high-pitched metal sound that made me wince. As I walked down the stone path toward the backyard, the house loomed over me like a giant observer, its glass walls reflecting the pale light of the moon but revealing nothing of what was inside. I reached the patio area, which was a massive expanse of dark tiles surrounding a swimming pool that was filled with perfectly still, black water. There was no one in the pool, and the outdoor furniture was covered in plastic sheets, looking like a graveyard of small ghosts in the dim light. I stood there, feeling like a target in the middle of a clearing, and I called out to see if anyone was there, but the only response was the wind whistling through the trees. I turned to head back to the gate, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard a heavy thud, followed by the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place on the gate I had just walked through. I ran back to the gate and pulled on it, but it was now locked tight, and the iron bars were too high for me to climb over without getting caught on the sharp decorative spikes at the top. I turned back to the patio and saw that several floodlights had suddenly flickered on, but they weren't pointed at the pool. They were pointed directly at me, blinding me with their intense white glare. From the darkness beyond the lights, I heard the sound of multiple people whispering, their voices overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell how many there were or where they were standing. A voice finally boomed over an outdoor speaker system, telling me that I was now a participant in a performance piece and that I had exactly 5 minutes to find a way out of the backyard before they let the dogs out. The terror I felt was cold and paralyzing, but the sound of a low, guttural growl coming from a kennel at the far end of the yard snapped me into action. I didn't have time to think about the cruelty of the situation. I only knew that I was being hunted by bored people with too much money and no conscience. I scanned the perimeter of the backyard, seeing that it was surrounded by a 10-foot stone wall that was slick with moss and impossible to grip. My eyes darted to the house, and I realized that one of the glass sliding doors leading to the kitchen was slightly unlatched, likely left that way by a careless servant or perhaps as a secondary trap. I didn't have another choice, so I sprinted toward the glass door just as the sound of a heavy metal latch clicking open echoed across the patio. I heard the paws of a large animal hitting the tile behind me, the sound of the beast gaining speed with every second as I reached for the handle of the sliding door. I threw it open and dived inside, sliding the door shut and locking it just as a massive black shadow slammed into the glass with enough force to make the entire frame vibrate. I was inside the house now, standing in a kitchen that was worth more than my entire life, but I was still trapped in a maze of darkness with people who were watching me on security cameras. I could hear them laughing over the speakers, their voices echoing through the empty halls, telling me that the front door was also locked and that I should try to find the hidden key before they came inside to find me themselves. I realized then that they were playing with me like a cat plays with a mouse, and that the only way to win was to stop playing their game and change the rules. I remembered that in houses like this, the fire alarm system is usually connected directly to the local emergency services to protect the expensive art and structure. I grabbed a heavy copper pot from the stove and smashed it against a glass display case filled with wine. Then I took a decorative lighter from the counter and held it under a smoke detector near the ceiling. Within seconds, the loudest siren I have ever heard began to wail through the house, and the overhead sprinklers activated, drenching everything in a cold, heavy mist. The laughter over the speakers stopped instantly, replaced by panicked shouting as the intruders realized that the police and the fire department would be arriving within minutes. I found a heavy chair and threw it through one of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, the glass shattering into a million pieces and creating a hole large enough for me to jump through. I landed on the front lawn and sprinted toward my car, which was still idling in the driveway like a beacon of safety. I drove through the front gate just as the first police cruiser was pulling into the neighborhood, its blue and red lights reflecting off the trees. I never looked back, and I never checked the app to see if that tip went through. When the authorities investigated, they found the house belonged to a corporation and was being rented out to a group that used fake identities. They found the steak I had delivered sitting on the patio table, untouched, a silent witness to the night I almost became a toy for people who have forgotten what it means to be human.